6. Appeal to consequences of a belief. An appeal to consequences, or argumentum ad consequentiam, is a logical fallacy where the truth or falsity of a proposition is judged based on the desirability or undesirability of its consequences, rather than its actual validity. Arguments of this type are fallacious because the consequences of a belief are not necessarily related to its truth value. For example, a belief may have good consequences but still be false. Two forms of the appeal to consequences. This fallacy has two main forms. Positive consequences, arguing that a proposition is true because its consequences are desirable. Example: if we don't believe in a divine punishment after death, then there would be no moral order, and everyone would get away with their bad behavior. I don't want that, so there must be a divine punishment. Negative consequences, arguing that a proposition is false because its consequences are undesirable. Example: if there is no objective morality, then all bad people go unpunished. I don't like that outcome. Therefore, morality must be objective. Why it's a fallacy. The flaw in this reasoning lies in the separation of the desired outcome from the actual truth of the matter. A statement's desirability or undesirability in terms of its effects does not determine if the statement itself is true or false. Real-world examples. Anti-vaccine arguments. Some parents reject vaccines not because of the evidence for their efficacy, but because acknowledging potential side effects might imply they made mistakes when vaccinating their children, a consequence that is emotionally unbearable. Religious arguments. Believers may accept a particular faith because of the promised good consequences of eternal reward or the avoidance of eternal punishment, rather than through evidence for the faith itself. The appeal to the consequences of a belief is a fallacy that comes in the following patterns. X is true because if people did not accept X as being true, then there would be negative consequences. X is false because if people did not accept X as being false, then there would be negative consequences. X is true because accepting that X is true has positive consequences. X is false because accepting that X is false has positive consequences. I wish that X were true, therefore X is true. This is known as wishful thinking. I wish that X were false, therefore X is false. This is known as wishful thinking. This line of reasoning is fallacious because the consequences of a belief have no bearing on whether the belief is true or false. For example, if someone were to say if 16-headed purple unicorns don't exist, then I would be miserable, so they must exist, it would be clear that this would not be a good line of reasoning. It is important to note that the consequences in question are the consequences that stem from the belief. It is important to distinguish between a rational reason to believe, RRB, opening parenthesis, evidence, and a prudential reason to believe, PRB, opening parenthesis, motivation. A RRB is evidence that objectively and logically supports the claim. A PRB is a reason to accept the belief because of some external factor, such as fear, a threat, or a benefit or harm that may stem from the belief. That is relevant to what a person values, but is not relevant to the truth or falsity of the claim. The nature of the fallacy is especially clear in the case of wishful thinking. Obviously, merely wishing that something is true does not make it true. This fallacy differs from the appeal to belief fallacy in that the appeal to belief involves taking a claim that most people believe that X is true to be evidence for X being true. Examples of appeal to consequences of a belief. God must exist. If God did not exist, then all basis for morality would be lost and the world would be a horrible place. It can never happen to me. If I believed it could, I could never sleep soundly at night. I don't think that there will be a nuclear war. If I believed that, I wouldn't be able to get up in the morning. I mean, how depressing. I acknowledge that I have no argument for the existence of God. However, I have a great desire for God to exist and for there to be an afterlife. Therefore I accept that God exists. 7. Appeal to emotion. An appeal to emotion, pathos, is a rhetorical tactic that attempts to persuade an audience by evoking specific feelings like pity, fear, or joy, rather than by providing relevant facts or logical arguments. While emotions can be a valid part of communication, the appeal to emotion fallacy occurs when emotion becomes the primary basis for an argument, substituting for evidence and logic. Common emotional appeals involve using anecdotes, metaphors, or vivid imagery to elicit a strong emotional response from the audience. How it works. Evokes feelings. The speaker or writer uses loaded language, evocative stories, or striking images to make the audience feel a particular emotion, such as sympathy, anger, or happiness. Bypasses reason. Instead of presenting a sound argument supported by evidence, the focus shifts to the audience's emotional reaction to a situation or idea. Examples of tactics. Anecdotes. A brief, personal story that illustrates a point and creates an emotional connection. Metaphors and similes. Comparing something to an emotionally charged concept, such as calling a misleading argument a red herring. Visuals. Using images of cute animals or struggling individuals to create sympathy or urgency. Why it can be fallacious. Lack of evidence. The argument relies on feelings rather than on data, facts, or reasoning. Misdirection. Emotional appeals can distract from the lack of substance in an argument. Manipulation. In some cases, appeals to emotion are used to manipulate people into agreeing with a claim without proper consideration. Legitimate versus fallacious appeals. Legitimate use. Emotions can be valid tools for making an argument more relatable or for connecting with an audience on a deeper level, as long as they complement, rather than replace, logical reasoning. Fallacious use. The fallacy arises when the appeal to emotion is the sole or primary justification for a claim, ignoring the need for evidence and rational thought. An appeal to emotion is a fallacy with the following structure. Favorable emotions are associated with X. Therefore, X is true. This fallacy is committed when someone manipulates people's emotions in order to get them to accept a claim as being true. More formally, this sort of reasoning involves the substitution of various means of producing strong emotions in place of evidence for a claim. If the favorable emotions associated with X influence the person to accept X as true because they feel good about X, then he has fallen prey to the fallacy. This sort of reasoning is very common in politics and it serves as the basis for a large portion of modern advertising. Most political speeches are aimed at generating feelings in people so that these feelings will get them to vote or act a certain way. In the case of advertising, the commercials are aimed at evoking emotions that will influence people to buy certain products. In most cases, such speeches and commercials are notoriously free of real evidence. This sort of reasoning is quite evidently fallacious. It is fallacious because using various tactics to incite emotions in people does not serve as evidence for a claim. For example, if a person were able to inspire in a person an incredible hatred of the claim that 1 + 1 = 2 and then inspired the person to love the claim that 1 + 1 = 3, it would hardly follow that the claim that 1 + 1 = 3 would be adequately supported. It should be noted that in many cases it is not particularly obvious that the person committing the fallacy is attempting to support a claim. In many cases, the user of the fallacy will appear to be attempting to move people to take an action, such as buying a product or fighting in a war. However, it is possible to determine what sort of claim the person is actually attempting to support. In such cases, one needs to ask what sort of claim is this person attempting to get people to accept and act on? Determining this claim, or claims, might take some work. However, in many cases it will be quite evident. For example, if a political leader is attempting to convince her followers to participate in certain acts of violence by the use of a hate speech, then her claim would be you should participate in these acts of violence. In this case, the evidence would be the hatred evoked in the followers. This hatred would serve to make them favorable inclined towards the claim that they should engage in the acts of violence. As another example, a beer commercial might show happy, scantily clad men and women prancing about a beach, guzzling beer. In this case, the claim would be you should buy this beer. The evidence would be the excitement evoked by seeing the beautiful people guzzling the beer. This fallacy is actually an extremely effective persuasive device. As many people have argued, people's emotions often carry much more force than their reason. Logical argumentation is often difficult and time-consuming, and it rarely has the power to spur people to action. It is the power of this fallacy that explains its great popularity and wide usage. However, it is still a fallacy. In all fairness, it must be noted that the use of tactics to inspire emotions is an important skill. Without an appeal to people's emotions, it is often difficult to get them to take action or to perform at their best. For example, no good coach presents her team with syllogisms before the big game. Instead, she inspires them with emotional terms and attempts to fire them up. There is nothing inherently wrong with this. However, it is not any acceptable form of argumentation. As long as one is able to clearly distinguish between what inspires emotions and what justifies a claim, one is unlikely to fall prey to this fallacy. As a final point, in many cases it will be difficult to distinguish an appeal to emotion from some other fallacies, and in many cases multiple fallacies may be committed. For example, many ad hominems will be very similar to appeals to emotion, and, in some cases, both fallacies will be committed. As an example, a leader might attempt to invoke hatred of a person to inspire his followers to accept that they should reject her claims. The same attack could function as an appeal to emotion and a personal attack. In the first case, the attack would be aimed at making the followers feel very favorable about rejecting her claims. In the second case, the attack would be aimed at making the followers reject the person's claims because of some perceived or imagined defect in her character. This fallacy is related to the appeal to popularity fallacy. Despite the differences between these two fallacies, they are both united by the fact that they involve appeals to emotions. In both cases, the fallacies aim at getting people to accept claims based on how they or others feel about the claims and not based on evidence for the claims. Another way to look at these two fallacies is as follows. 7. Appeal to emotion. An appeal to emotion is an informal logical fallacy where someone tries to win an argument by manipulating the audience's emotions rather than using facts or logic. This technique, also known as argumentum ad passiona or pathos, relies on eliciting feelings like fear, anger, or pity to sway an audience, often in advertisements or political speeches, by bypassing rational thought and substituting it with emotional appeals. How it works. Emotional manipulation. The core of this fallacy is the deliberate attempt to evoke strong feelings in the audience to make them more receptive to a particular conclusion. Substitution of reason. Instead of providing evidence or logical reasoning, the argument relies on emotional triggers, such as images of suffering children or promises of a better future, to persuade the audience. Widespread use. Appeals to emotion are common in various forms of communication, including advertisements, political campaigns, and propaganda, where emotions are a simple and effective means of influencing behavior and thought. Why it's a fallacy. Irrelevance of emotion. While emotions can be relevant to arguments, the appeal to emotion fallacy occurs when feelings are used as a substitute for evidence. Bypassing logic. This type of appeal encourages irrational beliefs or behaviors by overriding an audience's ability to analyze an argument's logical basis. Unconscious influence. Emotions can influence our reasoning subconsciously, making us more vulnerable to arguments that are unsound but emotionally compelling. Examples. Charity ads. An advertisement showing sad images of suffering animals to encourage donations, rather than providing data on the charity's effectiveness. Political promises. A politician promising a prosperous future to distract from the lack of a concrete plan for economic issues like inflation. Product marketing. An advertisement suggesting that buying a particular product will make you the happiest person, playing on the desire for happiness rather than detailing the product's actual benefits.